It's the red one.
Yes. Well, welcome everybody back to the Career Pivot. I'm Missy Gluckman. I'm so happy you're here. And if you're new to our conversations about changing careers, I'm especially happy you're here. For those of you who have returned, I'm grateful that you're here. And we will go ahead and talk about the Career Pivot. So I'm Missy Gluckman again from Melly Global, and this is the Career Pivot. Today we have Jackie Broussard here with us, and I think you can all see her on your screen, I hope. And Jackie is somebody that I met 5 years ago. Can that be right, Jackie, out there?
Or I'm maybe 4 or 3, so 3 or 4.
Yeah. Gosh, I feel like it's been longer, which is maybe a good thing. Jackie and I met, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about her background, and then she's going to talk a lot more than I'm going to talk about her background. And then we're going to open it up to questions. Ideally, you'll feel comfortable just unmuting yourselves and jumping in so that it really feels like a conversation. And if you don't want to share your last name, if this is a confidential process for you, we completely respect that. Jackie and I will do our best if we see your name come up on the chat or anything to just reference something you say. You can send me personal messages on the chat that I can then reference without mentioning your name if you have questions for Jackie. So we'll keep it as thoughtful and mindful as possible that way. But Jackie is a diversity and inclusion consultant now in her latest pivot, right, Jackie? And she does so for international educators and those in experiential education. And her career journey includes living and working in 5 countries. She's had a robust career in several different fields. Although she looks like she's about 22. She's had a 20-something year career. Yes, Jackie?
Yeah, that's right.
She has worked for Fortune, or done consulting, correct, for a Fortune 500 company. You've started 3 businesses. You've been a private coach. You've been a teacher. I know that you are very involved in fitness and nutrition for a long time through one of your own businesses. She is fueled by aha moments, as many of us in education in this group have been, with students and helping educators recognize their power to create spaces of belonging and belonging for all learners, which is hugely important. And outside of traveling, which we're all, I'm sure, waiting for the door to open for that to happen again, you will often find Jackie, I'm trying to say Jackie and tennis at the same time, and it came out as Jenny. You will find Jackie on a tennis court.
Yeah.
Welcome, Jackie.
I just came off of one, actually.
Oh, well, how was it? Where are you? So you can tell us weather-wise what's going on for you.
The weather here in Oklahoma, Tulsa, Oklahoma, is where I just recently moved from Arlington, Virginia. Literally like 6 weeks ago, I moved here to be closer to family during COVID, and the weather here is amazing. It's like 71 degrees and sunny, blue skies, so it's a perfect tennis day.
Yeah, it's one of the benefits going a little bit more south. I'm in North Carolina, so we're having one of those days here too, which is lovely.
Nice.
Okay, so Jackie and I are going to just have a conversation, and you're all going to listen in, join in, comment, share your thoughts, and we'll take a few minutes at the end to make sure your questions are out there and that she can answer them, and I can maybe chime in if I have something useful to say. So I do want to share before we go, and if this person is online, I did get an email from someone who mentioned that this person used a tip that we had in the last session and put out a resume as a result of it and got 2 interviews, including one in person. After a phone or a Zoom probably interview. So if that person is here and wants to send me a private chat, if they want to share their experience with that little minor change, that would be a great tip for us to wrap with, I think. Okay, so Jackie, you have changed careers several times. Maybe, although I've given a little bit of background, maybe you can talk a little bit about what prompted and motivated you to have these career pivots, and talk us through that a little bit.
Yeah, so you mentioned that I worked for a Fortune 500 company. That was my first job out of graduate school. I got an international MBA, and mainly because I had had a study abroad experience in college, like many of us, and I wanted to travel again. And this particular MBA program allowed me to do an internship abroad. And so that's kind of how I got an MBA. It wasn't because like I had some particular interest in business or et cetera. And so I just thought it was pretty cool. So I got to study with folks from around the world during my MBA. And so the natural progression from there is to become a business analyst slash consultant, for one of these big companies out there. And I ended up working for a company and traveled with them. Loved it. I loved that I got to work with, I was actually stationed, I was living in Panama City, Panama.
Mm-hmm.
And so the team that I was working with, they were from all over the world, all over, I should say, Latin America. And so we were speaking, I got to practice my Spanish literally all day long. I never spoke a word of English. And and they were from all countries in Latin America. And so that was really incredible to me. I got to do a lot of traveling while I was doing that. And I love that. But then it was pretty clear to me early on that the corporate world was not for me. Um, I I don't know. I mean, it was just a personal thing that I um, didn't feel. I felt like it was a bit too constraining for how I wanted to spend my days, and so um, that's when I started to kind of think about like, okay, what's next? I ended up I started a small business after that, and that was my first foray into entrepreneurship. Um, and then eventually, long story short, it, I was a Hurricane Katrina refugee.
Ah.
And while I was, in exile in my parents' home here in Tulsa, Oklahoma for a couple of years, I was like, okay, so now like it's like one of those transitional periods. Like you're like, okay, now it's a time if I'm gonna do something different, let's do it. So that's how I got into fitness. And I have always really appreciated the role that mentors and coaches have had in my life.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to play that role and to, similarly, help other people to reach their personal goals. And so, yeah, it was a long, really happy career in fitness. I really enjoy working with folks and helping them to, realize their potential, their inner strength and power, their ability to reach their personal goals. Mm-hmm. That was a huge part of that work. And I loved just, being able to control the way that I worked in my schedule and who I took on as clients, et cetera.
Right.
And so, yeah, there came a time though when I really missed the whole international intercultural work and travel. And so I was like, okay, I want to do something similar to that, but I want to take my coaching and my mentoring skills with me.
Yeah.
And so that's when I decided I wanted to get into education, because education really is about, helping folks kind of like discover something within them. And, that happened throughout my schooling. And I can remember all of those teachers that had this impact on my life and really opened the world for me. So that's where the connection was between those two fields.
Yeah.
Got into international education, led programs, taught a couple of courses abroad, and very quickly realized that there was a need there in international education. As we know, it's not the most inclusive field when it comes, an accessible field when it comes to, non-traditional, what we call non-traditional students, feeling like it's a place for them.
Mm-hmm.
And I myself consider myself a non-traditional student. I was the only person of color who studied on my study abroad program, and it was a very different experience for me than it was for my peers. And so
Right.
that's the need that I saw in international education. So that's how I ended up where I am now.
And and how did you feel that you could create skills to build that bridge to get in the door in those jobs, right? Because so often people have come to me as a coach and said, well, I studied abroad, so I want to recreate my experience for others, or I want others to have the same experience as me. And having the experience, but administering and guiding people through the experience are two completely different things, right? And I think it was somewhere around the time that we met, because I remember our conversation when I looked at your resume early on, and you did have a lot of international experience. So how did you look around for things to do that built the confidence for you to walk in the door and say, I can add value here. I can show you that my piece of paper, my resume looks this way, but these are really the skills that I bring to you. So talk us through that a little bit.
Yeah. Um, it was very deliberate steps that I took.
Yes.
And, I mentioned earlier the role of coaches and mentors.
Mm-hmm.
That was huge for me. I had, when I was making my first transition, um, I, in my first transition from fitness to education, I was living in California at the time, and I hired a professional coach.
Mm-hmm.
And that person was really crucial in helping me identify, like, what are these skills that you can take forward and use. It's not about like trying to, um, you know, hide your previous career and make it look like you've been doing this, education all along. It's about like highlighting the things that you were doing before that make you a good candidate in this field. And so
Exactly.
that was really key for me in giving me confidence. And then I also later when I was getting into international education, trying to make that kind of shift from education to international education,
Mm-hmm.
I was a member of the cohort, Missy's cohort. And so that also was key for me, just like being around folks who were, doing the same thing. They were making a transition, helped me to know that I wasn't alone. And to develop the skills, what I did is I did a lot of volunteering.
Yes.
And volunteering helped me, like, it gave me energy. It gave me the energy that I needed to like keep going forward, because I wasn't just kind of sitting around like twiddling my thumbs or like writing resumes or applications. I was actually going out and developing some skills, and it was specifically in things that I was super interested in. It
Right.
wasn't just like, let's just grab whatever volunteer job is available. I volunteered for the International Rescue Committee. I was working with Central American migrants.
Mm-hmm.
So in that way, I was able to do that like personal work, like working with folks and helping them, actually bring their children who were in Central America over to the US.
Mm-hmm.
And then also practicing my Spanish. So that was key for that. I ended up working for a study abroad organization that takes high school students and sends them abroad. So that was one key. I got to like work with students and plan pre-departure programs, et cetera. And then another huge volunteer position that I had was I joined Toastmasters. I don't know if you've heard of Toastmasters before.
Yeah, but tell everybody a little bit about
Yeah.
Toastmasters in case they don't know.
Yeah.
Please.
So Toastmasters is a public speaking organizations, professional development organization. So it's in every like major city in the US or in the world actually.
Oh, yeah.
And you can join a local club. I joined a club that was bilingual, it was Spanish English, and that way I got to,
Awesome.
you know, interact with native speakers and practice my Spanish, not only my Spanish, but my public speaking Spanish, like giving speeches every week. And so that's what we did. We met every week um, and you know, gave speeches and encouraged each other, supported each other, gave each other feedback, and that was also, you know, skill building, event planning, you know, designing professional development, working with, you know, managing others.
So the volunteering was a key aspect of that in your case, because you were really going from apples to oranges, right? There was this continuous thread of, I want to serve, I don't want to be part of a larger machine in your case with the
Mhm.
corporate world. You recognize that early on. And then you have this theme of strength and power. And when I read your bio, I'm so happy that you said that, because you talked about how what you're doing now is really your focus is in reminding people of the power and influence they can have in changing the dynamics of a space by including everyone in a way
Yeah,
that's meaningful, right?
right.
And then your love of international. So you've been sort of setting these steps along the way, and you've now somehow married them together to create this unique position for
Right.
yourself. What's interesting to me too is because a lot of people come to this world or are in this space, and if you are out there, feel free to jump on the chat and share this too, because they're not sure how to get from point A to point B. I mean, in your case, you said, I studied abroad and I was the only person of color in my group, and I had a very different experience than others, which is very common in our field. For those of you who are in international education or study abroad, that may sound familiar, but we have people in this group who are from lots of different backgrounds. This is not just specific to education, but you come from this background where that happens personally, and then you come full circle, and now you're teaching people the value of how to understand the value, but also how to get there, right? The path to
Mhm.
change their operations, their belief systems, their values, their processes, to encourage and facilitate a change of the communities that go abroad. And so that's a very niche specific kind of training field, right? That again isn't like saying, well, I studied abroad, so I can be a study abroad advisor. Well, I was the only student of color in my program, so I can be a diversity and inclusion
Mhm.
consultant, right? You typically can't. That's a whole field. Some people
Mhm.
go get degrees and multiple degrees on that. So tell us a little bit about, again, for people out there who are thinking, I just can't quite see yet the A to B, or I'm not even sure what the B is yet, right? And so for those people, the volunteering, the playing in the sandbox, finding things we talked about last week, for those of you who were on last week, thinking about things you loved doing as a child, thinking about your hobbies and such, the things you keep returning to. Tell us a little bit though, with the diversity and inclusion, which is such, thankfully, a hot topic now and a hot job and an important one, how you made that leap.
Yeah. So I said that I got into international education as a program leader, leading groups of US students abroad. And that was in Costa Rica, Dominican Republic, and China. And I also taught a couple of courses, one in international business and one in diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Ah,
Actually, the name was not that. The name was, let me see, Identity, Politics, and Equity was the name of my course. And when I was actually asked to teach this course, because the administrators knew that I had a lot of background and passion
mhm.
in that area. And so um, I was like, okay, yeah, I want to teach that course. And so I was really, I loved it. I mean, I loved interacting with my students on like these topics that we just really don't talk about every day, like our identity and how it affects our lives.
Mhm.
And so these are like just kind of really stimulating discussions that I had with my students. And and so but yeah, like I always went back to, I kept thinking about like what was, you know, like what was my first experience like? who are the students that are on this program now, and who's here and who's not here. And so I really wanted to make a space where this space that I love so much, I wanted to make it something that people who looked like me felt like they belonged in. And so, and it's not often the case. And so that's kind of where the transition to like becoming a diversity and equity consultant, because I ended up for that same organization kind of pitching a workshop on DEI for their like instructor training at the beginning of the year, the next year. And they were like, yeah, sounds good, let's do it. And I ended up, becoming their person, their go-to person when it comes to equity and inclusion. So.
And so this is a really important reminder to folks out there that you don't have to come in. So many of you are concerned that I need a degree, I need a certification, I have to go back to school, I have to spend a lot of money or make a tremendous investment. And sometimes it's kind of going back to our own history and saying what has happened in my life and on my journey that makes me unique from others, that has a different angle on this topic. And that often is what helps people stand out. And then, as Jackie said, creating this opportunity by saying, well, I'd like to do this for you. And sometimes in the beginning of a career transition, it's about experiencing new things so that you can assess what your skills are, see what you like and what you don't like. But it's also your chance to put yourself out there and say, I'll do this, I'll volunteer, I'll do a workshop. It builds that body of work that we all need to back us up if we're going in for interviews and planning on putting resumes and things out there.
Yeah, and I have to say, Missy, that was a huge inflection point for me, because it was just something that I came up with. I was like, we don't do diversity training in our program leader instructor trainings before we send these educators out into the world.
Yeah.
And so I know this organization, I know what they need. And I know what they need, not only from working there, but also from my own personal experiences and from all of the work that I was doing and researching. And they said yes. And so I think that's also a huge lesson for me. It was like, what are you really excited about, and what do you really want to do? And sometimes you can imagine that and bring it to fruition.
Exactly. So for the path for many people is going to be applying for a job that exists already. But sometimes the path that folks can't even see yet, and that was part of my journey too. Melanie B Global was not something that I, spent my life thinking I was going to do. I dreamed it up very late in my career. Sometimes the path is that you build something on your own. So we never know where it's going to go.
Right.
I'm going to open it up to questions, Jackie. I think that people need to hear from you and get their questions answered. So let's see what's on your minds, everybody. Go ahead and just unmute yourself if you're happy to unmute yourself and talk to Jackie directly, or if you have a question for me, feel free to jump on the chat. I'm gonna invite you on the chat and I'll say ask away. Let us know what's on your mind. If there's any aha moments, I'm big on honoring silence to give you all a moment to reflect on what Jackie said, finish taking your notes. So let's go ahead and honor silence for a moment while folks compose their questions, and we'll get to them. Good time for water, everybody. Okay, and I did get a private note from that person who I'd referenced earlier. And I'll share the situation if that person chooses to unmute themselves, then feel free to at any point. But last week we were talking about the resume and someone had posed the question, I'm overqualified for too many jobs. And Jackie, you may have found that also along the way, having an MBA, although when you're switching into education, having a second degree is usually beneficial. But for a lot of people, they have gone on for a master's or a JD or an MBA or PhD, EDD, other things, postdocs, and then they say, well, I can't get in the door because everybody assumes I'm overqualified and then I'll cost too much, or they don't want to talk with me. They don't want me to have a higher terminal degree than me. And this person, I had said, leave it off your resume. And for a lot of people, that's really jarring and shocking. And this person emailed me during the week and said, that resume change, it was a great suggestion. I never dreamed that I could leave something off my resume. But having a graduate degree wasn't relevant to the job I applied for. And so that person did get an interview, which is terrific. So thank you for sharing that story. Okay, any questions, any thoughts, any concerns? Are you all concerned at all about how to, again, build that bridge between your experiences now and things you want to put on a resume? And other things. I do have a question here that came in privately, whatever. I'm throwing things out that come up commonly, so feel free to expand upon that. I have a question, a private question here. Jackie mentioned a career coach who helped her identify the skills she already had to pivot instead of hiding her previous work that maybe wasn't clearly aligned to where she wanted to go. Can you talk more about this idea? For those of us in higher ed, it's such a niche area. What specific tips do you have to make yourself stand out for new roles outside of your current field? Great question. Jackie, you can perhaps talk to your experience and what you've experienced and what advice that coach had given you. And then I'll be happy to jump in and share my thoughts on that too.
Yeah, it's a good point. We are so niche in international education specifically. And so I think it was helpful having, because when I was changing careers into education, I wasn't necessarily thinking specifically international education at that time. And so at that time, I had just a general coach that didn't have any background in the field. And she was still it was still such a valuable experience, because I just assumed like, this is like, how am I ever going to do this? You know, like I have been going along on this path and on the face, it looks nothing like what I'm trying to do. How does that work? And so she helped me to translate those skills and give me the confidence and bring out, like, it was just kind of like in one-on-ones we talk and she'd bring out like, well, what about this? What did you say you did this, you planned this event, this fitness event. Let's talk more about that. Like what went into that, you know? And so that's, you know, like that was huge because there were so many skills that I was using at that, you know, time. And so I was like, oh, I had totally forgotten about that. Like hadn't even thought about that. And so, but when I did decide to go into international education, that's when I sought out, you know, some very field specific or industry specific coaching with the cohort. And that it made a huge difference because, yeah, just kind of like knowing like what are folks looking for in the interviews, okay? Like what are some things they're interested or they're focusing in on when they are doing the negotiation, you know, for salaries and that kind of thing. And so it was, yeah, very specific.
And that's a really good point. I'm going to speak to skills more broadly because I work with people from lots of different fields. I'll just jump in here though and say that Jackie referenced a program I teach. It's called the IECA now, the International Ed Career Academy. And that's a whole separate program that I teach from, that's separate from a course I'll be teaching in the new year called the Career Pivot, which is a much more expanded version of this. But generally the short answer could be pull out a job description, anyone. Doesn't have to be in your field, doesn't have to be anything that interests you. And look at the verbs that start almost every bullet of the job description. They're going to say things like manage, communicate, organize, facilitate. And when you really stop and think about the work that you've done, whether you're green and you've just come out of your first job, or whether you are someone who's had 25 or 30 years experience, when you start thinking about all the things you've done, whether it's as an undergrad or a real seasoned person, most of the things you've done are verbs. You start with those verbs that end up on a job posting. And then it's a matter, that's a hint for how you can start to build that bridge, right? That bridge very much evolves from, I'm just checking the time here because I want to respect everybody's time. But that bridge very much starts with those verbs. What have I done in my career? Dig a little deeper. And you'll start to see things that are so much more obvious than you realized initially. So that's my little tip for today.
Yep.
Okay, somebody else is asking, how would you recommend getting into international education, study abroad, without having actually worked or done a study abroad experience? So that's interesting. Jackie had a study abroad experience. I don't know if you want to comment on this. I definitely have an answer that might sound very out of left field, but it's strategic and it could help.
I think I'm going to let you answer that, Mrs.
Okay. So, my first knee-jerk reaction would have been, you're not going to get a job without having studied abroad. It's going to be really, really difficult. And my thought behind that is during COVID, it's going to be almost impossible or very, very difficult. I don't want to say impossible. It would be very difficult because people have lost jobs. And so you have a lot of really great people out there who have experience. With that said, entry-level positions at almost any type of field are a foot in the door. And then the second thing is that, to Jackie's point earlier, sometimes we have a unique story, right, that kind of makes people pay attention. And so Jackie's story that she was sharing with us was, I was the one student on my program who was of color, and that was a completely different experience for me. And it's something that stayed with her for many years, and she has a lot that she could say about that. Your story could be, I didn't study abroad, and I am still trying at this point in my life to do that. And therefore, without even having done it, I know how impactful it is from stories from others, from experiences that have given you input to want to have some say in this field or participation in this field. That's a very strategic answer. It's not a very likely answer because of COVID right now. A little tricky because of that. Without knowing your background, I don't know if you've traveled extensively, if you have some sort of language experience. Like Jackie, for example, is multilingual. That would really help. So I don't know the details, and if you want to go ahead and share them with me, I'm happy to share more about that, because I don't want to say it's impossible. It's not. It's just, it's very unique, your situation. Usually people want to enter the field because they have experience in it.
Yeah, and I definitely agree with that. And I would say, like, if you have interest in this field, it's probably because you have had some international experiences, right? Whether they be, a lot of people have had international experiences by hosting international students, when they were younger, their families hosted. And so playing up those experiences, also, like, if you've traveled extensively, that's something to play up. And there are also, and this doesn't happen in this pandemic world, but there are also volunteer jobs you can do all over the world. And it's like, okay, I'm going to take 3 weeks and go to Peru. And so those are things that you can be building up.
And I'm going to actually back up a little bit and correct myself. I'm not going to say it's as hard as you think, because what I was thinking is that most people will come to me and say, I want to be a study abroad advisor, right? It's sort of like saying, I want to advise on something I haven't done before. And that's okay. It's not that you couldn't do a good job of it. It can be something that you can learn. With that said, within international education, within higher education, there are so many different lanes these days. There's marketing positions, social media positions, people who work in finance specifically to work on the money end of things. So there are lots, again, it would really kind of depend on where you would see yourself in there. But I would take Jackie's advice and see where you could volunteer or get some experience meanwhile. Okay, so we have a question here. From Joan, in terms of translating skills, did you find your need to adjust your terminology? Did you find you needed to adjust terminology? Go ahead, Jackie. Did you have to do
Yeah,
that?
definitely. um, the first transition, not so much because it was from corporate to owning my own business. So um, I didn't ever write a resume at that point.
Right.
But for sure, when I was transitioning to education, because it was like fitness to education, like, okay, they're speaking, it's like two different languages, right? So, okay, what are the translations there? So definitely that's where the cohort, the international education cohort helped.
Yes, and I would second that. Terminology is huge. Your vocabulary is very discipline specific right now, and you're going to want to study the vocabulary of job postings and fields and start to adjust your vocabulary accordingly. So it's a great question. And I go into a lot more coaching on the resume side. I'm sure Jackie remembers some of the very nuanced things that I teach on the resume side of things about how to do that effectively. You know, I do have a hard stop today, so we're going to take one more, maybe two more questions, and then we'll wrap up. We have more sessions coming though, so please don't fear. We have a lot more conversations to have. Somebody sent a private chat. Thank you, Jackie, for sharing your journey and using your strengths to pursue what you love. My question, I work in international ed development like refugee and girls education and early grade reading. The field is dominated by white people and they push their values on the local people and staff. How do you navigate your way and bring yourself, I am a person of color, and work from that place? Can you share recommendations? Thank you for trusting this group and trusting Jackie with an answer for that. Please, I'll let Jackie certainly speak to that.
Yeah, thank you for that question.
Mm-hmm.
I find that look for your sphere of influence. Um, and if you're working directly with young people, or if you're a person that's more working with partners in the different locations where you work, so who do you work with? What is your sphere of influence? And go from there. So if, for example, like I would just say, my example would be as like a professor that was teaching international business. And so in my curriculum, um, I knew that I always felt like I was missing from curriculums as I studied, throughout my studies, undergrad, elementary, et cetera. There was little emphasis on people like me. And so, and it was very uniform. It was like centering of people of a certain socioeconomic class, certain religions, et cetera. And so, what about all the other stories out there that can be told? And so, if, for example, you are that teacher that's working directly with students, bring those different stories into your curriculum. And also, I always speak about my identity to my students and how my identity has impacted my experience in my schooling and in my career, because I want my students to be able to speak openly about that themselves. And there are various intersections of identities out there that that students should feel comfortable doing. So find your sphere of influence, do what you can do within that, and you'll find that it starts to grow and grow and grow. And yeah.
Thank you, Jackie, and thank you again for that question. And that one may take more reflection, so if Jackie has other thoughts, I'm sure she'll share them with me and I can get them out to the group. We did have what I thought was a question, is actually a great comment. A person said, someone applied for a position at her job without study abroad experience and taught students English virtually in China, and she got a phone interview. So that's proof that you don't necessarily have to have experience the way that is traditionally done, right? So that's great. Okay. I am so sorry that I have to run, but we are over time again. How shocking, because I think we could talk about this topic all day long. Jackie, any closing thoughts? If maybe you could share one really like, this is, if I had to give you one tip, this is the tip I would give you. Or
Okay.
words of encouragement or anything you want to leave these folks with to give them some forward thinking ideas.
Okay, I had several tips, so I now have to pick one. Okay, let me think.
No, you could throw a couple out.
Okay,
But
well,
what would be your top one?
okay, the top one, don't go it alone. Find other people who are doing what you're doing, whether that means from to a specific field or not. If they're just transitioning to a different field, period. Find other people who are doing the same thing. Try to meet with them regularly so that you don't feel like you're alone. And then also, find people who are doing things that you're inspired by. And just reach out to them, try to connect with them, listen to their stories for inspiration for your own story. And I would say my other tip, I'll say my another number two is looking for a job is like owning a business. The business is your job search, and the employee that you're managing is you. And so most of us have never really had to manage ourselves, our time, our energy, and our attention. And so learning though how to manage yourself and to use your energy, your attention, your creativity to move you forward in your job search.
That is such great advice. I love the analogy that you shared, Jackie. Well, we're getting a lot of love on the chat. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jackie. You can all thumbs up her, applaud, whatever works for you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Jackie, thank you for the wisdom that you shared. And thank you, everyone, for your time today. Great questions. We'll be back soon at the Career Pivot with other great folks like Jackie to give some advice. Have a beautiful day wherever you are in the world, or evening. And we'll catch you again soon. Thanks, Jackie.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.